All right, dear Deirdre Morrison, it's your turn. Please share with us. We are interested in that your story.
First and foremost, thank you, Obehi, for creating this opportunity to learn about the neuroscience of storytelling, and also to everyone here participating with curious minds today. Now, let me start by asking you something. If I say once upon a time, what happens? You expect the story, right?
Yeah.
You get ready to take a narrative on board. Well, I'm not here to disappoint you, so I do have a story that will help us to understand something important about how stories work in our minds, and why being aware of one of these things that I'm going to talk about today is key to operating in a slightly new way. Once upon a time, there was a little boy, and he was very excited. He was going to do something really fun with his dad. He knew his dad was going to love it, and he was going to love it, and they were going to have a great time. It was so special that he even got to stay up late to do it. They were going to watch a very special kind of football, which the little boy called Cup World. Everyone else called it the World Cup, but they knew what he meant. On the first night of Cup World, the little boy excitedly got ready and sat down to watch this special football. He'd seen all the ads for it, and like most kids, he just loved the big mascots that were being used to promote it. Just a few minutes after the match started, he burst into tears and ran out of the room to find his mum. And that's me, in case you haven't guessed. What's wrong? I was so surprised that he had run out of the room like this. What's wrong? I asked him. It's not Cup World, he wailed. It's just normal football. He wasn't really interested in football, so his insistence on watching Cup World had been a little bit unusual. It's not Cup World, I said. How do you know? And at this point, the tears were just streaming down his face, and he was starting to stammer and stutter. And he said, because there's no armadillos.
Are you an entrepreneur struggling to stand out in a crowded market? Your secret weapon is your story. Discover how to make your competition irrelevant by owning your story. Want to learn more? Check out our signature program, Own Your Story, a 5-week training to reshape your narrative. The link is what you see on your screen, academy.aclasses.org/story. Now back to the conversation.
If you're a little bit confused about this at the moment and how this connects, then don't worry, you weren't the only one who's confused at that point. But this was a classic case of imagination creating expectations that reality couldn't really deliver. So when he'd been watching all of these fun promotional videos featuring armadillos and other animals playing football, he had, in his imagination, built up this idea that Cup World was actually a tournament that was being played by these cartoon characters. Now, I'm not a football fan myself, but I can tell you that if there were matches featuring teams of armadillos, I might actually be tempted to watch them. So, unfortunately, the expectations that my son had created in that instance were not met. And the thing is that we have so many kinds of expectations in contact with our lives that we don't often really think about them too much. And quite often, the only time that we do give them any thought at all is when the armadillos don't show up, when we have built up an expectation and we are disappointed. So before we look at how and why these mini stories impact our lives and careers, let's take a quick detour and set up a few definitions of words that we use in this topic. Now, first of all, my specialism is applied neuroscience, and this is the area in which we take all those amazing discoveries that neuroscientists make in the labs and when they're doing their research, and we find ways to make them useful in the real world for everyday challenges. So, for instance, knowing that our brain uses a lot of energy and tries to maintain a state that we call homeostasis in our bodies is great, but it's pretty useless unless we understand how that's showing up in our lives, ways that it might be affecting us, like change resistance or not really being able to take new habits on board or being willfully blind to something or even lacking empathy. Understanding the brain better allows us to make more informed choices about things like expectations. So let's look at some definitions for these. An expectation is a strong belief that something will happen or be the case. An assumption is a thing that is accepted as true or certain to happen without any proof or evidence. And a prediction is a statement or a thought that encapsulates what you think will happen. Now, I want to bring in one more definition here. Iris has already mentioned it, and I'm sure we'll hear more about it today, and that's neuroplasticity. So, neuroplasticity, just as a reminder, is the brain's lifelong ability to learn and change and adapt. And it's really fantastic when you think about it. And I've actually heard it being described as a 6-syllable word for hope, which is rather lovely. And it is a very hopeful thing that we have this neuroplasticity. Um, but much like the concept of expectations, in itself, it's neither good nor bad. And we can just as easily learn something as unhelpful as we can learn something that is helpful. And our expectations can be damaging as much as they can be constructive. So the question that we've always got to be asking is, what is the most effective way to approach this situation or this line of thinking that I've got? And how can we be more effective? How can we think and act more effectively? And step one is always greater awareness. Now, already, we've only been here a few minutes, but we've already started to elevate our awareness in that little space of time. And we can start to see that, like in the case of my son, that expectations are a variety of story that we tell ourselves. And then we work on the basis that reality is somehow going to comply with this story. Now, in a few minutes, I'm going to help you to start sorting out some big buckets that expectations tend to fall into so that you can start diagnosing them in your life and business. But first of all, I want to talk for a minute about Taylor Swift. Now, I hope everybody in the group is aware of who Taylor Swift is, but if you're not, she's a sort of a phenomenon, I guess, in the music world. She has been around for a long time. She has absolutely legions of fans who love her music, including my daughter. My daughter is what they call a Swiftie, and she went down to Dublin recently to hear Taylor Swift playing. So, as well as being a hugely popular artist, Taylor Swift is now a business and a brand unto herself. She has become this much bigger entity than just a singer-songwriter. And for those people who have followed her career, liked her music, become her fans, they have certain expectations of her and the kind of music that she makes and records. So, for instance, if Taylor Swift decided that she wanted to take a new artistic direction and record a Swedish death metal album next, then that would not match her audience's expectations. And without a doubt, there would be some very disappointed or angry fans, as well as fans who felt that she had betrayed them by not continuing along the same vein that they had come to expect. And this idea about expectations, we can ask ourselves questions about this relating to our businesses. What is it that people expect? What do I want them to expect? Am I actually providing that? And what happens if I want to change, if I want to go in a new direction or try something new? Will they be able to come on that journey, or will they be confused and disappointed? I mean, let's take a little example. Say I had at one point in time decided to start a YouTube channel based on my love of cheese. And every week I put out a review of a different kind of cheese, and people start following this to get recommendations and reviews of cheese. And then I start working with cheese producers, and I, review their products and maybe have a little online cheese shop. And I might expand into crackers and cheese boards and cheese knives and things like that. That all makes sense. But if at some point I decide, okay, now I'm going to start selling tractors, that is a very, very big jump for people to try to make. So not only does the continuity of the story that I'm building with this business and my shared love of cheese with my audience get broken, also something else gets broken, and that is their interest in what I'm now interested in. So I have to be careful with that expectation and how I manage the transition for them. So, what I'd like to do now is just look at four big buckets of expectations. So, last week, myself and my colleague Gabriella Benko spent the week writing up the first draft of our book, which is going to be called Beyond Expectations. And in the research that we've been doing, we have identified what we call the four big buckets. And the first of those buckets is the expectations that we have of ourselves. Now, if we stick to the idea that we're looking and talking about things that are related to entrepreneurs today, one of the things that I have noticed in my time working with entrepreneurs is that quite often the expectations that they have of themselves are quite harsh and they lack in self-compassion because we use very comparative expectations. We use these stories about what other people are doing and we measure ourselves against them. So we might say something like, I should be further on because I can see someone else who started at the same time as me and they're much further on. Or I should be an expert in this or that because I admire someone who is. Or I should have a bigger mailing list because I know someone who's very successful and that's what they have. Or I should have a nicer office. Whatever it is, we start to feel and tell ourselves the story that what we have right now isn't enough. And we expect ourselves to somehow be somewhere else other than where we really are. And this, of course, is only part of these kinds of expectations that we have of ourselves. But, in this space of time today, we don't really have time to interrogate it all very deeply. But I just really like to give you the opportunity to start thinking about these expectations that we have of ourselves. And a top tip for identifying expectations, by the way, if you find yourself using the word should, when you hear should, then you're probably picking up or hearing an expectation at some level. So the question is at that point, is it a reasonable expectation or is it unreasonable? Is it actually going to motivate us to get somewhere or is it going to undermine our confidence? Is it going to make us more or less effective?
Thank you for watching. Are you enjoying the video? Let us know in the comment section. My mission is to help professionals like you to own their story. What would I do for you, you might ask? Well, it helps you make your competition irrelevant. Want to learn more? Check out our signature program, Own Your Story, a 5-week training to reshape your narrative. The link is what you see on your screen, academy.aclasses.org/story. Now back to the conversation.
So the next big bucket is the expectations that we have of other people. There are so many things that we expect of others, especially when they're people close to us, when they're a central part of our lives, whether that's a personal or a professional setting. One of the things that we sometimes, without knowing it or without thinking about it, expect is that they'll have the same values as us. Now, whether that's hard work or loyalty or being risk averse or even being on time, we have many, many values. And without realizing, we can often expect that others will see the world in the same way. And when they don't, that can cause some difficulty. So obviously there are lots of different ways of addressing this and lots of applied neuroscience that we use to optimize the way we appreciate differences and strengths. But we'll just keep going with this outline of the important bits for today. We can often expect that others will know what we mean or what our intentions are without fully explaining it. And in fact, sometimes we expect people to read our minds. And if they don't, we can get very upset. And here again, we tell ourselves little stories about what's going on. We might start asking, why didn't they know what I wanted or needed? Don't they understand me? Why aren't they paying attention to me? Well, it's largely they didn't know that thing or they didn't realize that because they're not psychic. And also, every bit as much noise and traffic and overwhelm and chatter that you've got going on inside your head, they've got that too. And even if you are the love of their life, they've still got all of that to contend with as well. And on top of that, they're still not psychic. So maybe that's why they didn't read it. And in a situation like this, rather than asking why they didn't automatically pick up on what we wanted or needed, we can start asking ourselves, if our communication was clear, did they actually know what we expected? This is a much fairer way of operating, one that's much more closely aligned with the sort of characteristics that are needed in leadership. And it's one that's more mature and responsible as well. Now, the next big bucket of expectations is the expectations that other people have of us. And this is an absolute minefield. And, we could spend the rest of this entire session without giving anyone else a go talking about the expectations that other people have of us. Some of these expectations are made very clear. And in a way, sometimes that's better. But some of them also are not verbalized at all. And it's almost like they expect us to be psychic, which is clearly unreasonable and something that we would never do ourselves, I think. So our family and our friends can have many kinds of expectations of us. And most of those expectations are often very well meant. In the main, the people who love us want us to do well. But our ideas of what doing well means can be very different. So, for instance, if we want to leave a career that we've built to start a business, this might make them very nervous because they don't know if we're going to be okay anymore. If we start to make a lot more money than them, that might also make them worry that we won't have anything in common with them anymore, or that they're going to somehow lose us, that we won't be like them anymore. And this, of course, it ties in very much to our sense of belonging. So, actually, just as an example, one instance that I came across at one stage was a very capable lady who was trying to start a business after her kids had grown up. And her family teased her absolutely mercilessly because she had started reading books about self development and starting businesses. And this was their way of resisting the change that she wanted because it would also mean changes for them. And they might have been changes that they might not like. It might have affected her availability to them, for instance. So these are all, ways that expectations can show up and get in the way of making progress, building businesses, and having good relationships. Other examples of things that families and friends might have as expectations of us include how we socialize, when we get married or have children, where we spend important holidays. And as well as expectations, a lot of these can also sometimes feel like assumptions. It's always been this way. And the eldest sibling will always host certain events or look after elderly parents. Or maybe the expectation is that the grandparents will get to spend lots of time with the grandkids. And of course, families can be big and messy and complicated these days with current and previous partners in the mix. And the expectations can be many and they can be difficult to navigate. And if you're wondering why this is important if we're talking about work and careers, then let me put it this way. Your brain's only got a certain amount of attention or bandwidth. And the more you're thinking or worrying about family expectations, then the less of that attention and bandwidth you've got to put into your business. It's that simple, really. There isn't sort of two discrete things that are work and life. It's more of an ecosystem, and we have to recognize that all of it pours into this one thing that goes to make up our existence in this world. And this is why it's important to recognize all of the areas that expectations come from. Excuse me. So, moving on to the final big bucket. This is big bucket number 4, and this is what we call meta expectations. This bucket includes a lot of expectations that we actually don't even realize we have. It's sort of like the bucket of ninja expectations. They're operating on a sort of a stealth level, and this is because a lot of them are just out there in our worlds. And if we haven't seen anything different to them, then we don't know that there are other possibilities. So in this multicultural, multi-denominational, global world, this is really something that's really very important to be aware of. In this bucket, there's also a lot of bias, things like identity, race, culture, but also our brain's own biases like confirmation bias or negativity bias. So if you remember right back at the start, I mentioned some ideas about how the brain works. Well, typically because it takes so much energy to run this expensive, complicated brain of ours, it likes to try and save energy by using some shortcuts. And some of those are based on expectations and assumptions and predictions. We use what we've learned with our neuroplasticity to form ideas about how to engage with a person or a situation. And because our brain is very interested in protecting us, quite often a negativity bias kicks in. We're more prone to noticing negative things because as we evolved, that kept us safe, and that's how we survived. So let's think again about our expectations. We can ask ourselves, do we generally expect good things to happen, or do we expect bad things to happen? Now, if our story is that bad things happen and we must protect ourselves against the bad things that we expect in the world, then how does that story, that worldview influence how we operate? How does it influence how we meet people? How does it influence how we expect to live? And similarly, if we expect that things are going to be okay, that we'll be safe and that good things will happen to us, how does that impact how we show up? How do we meet people? How do our expectations of life look? Now, again, just to be crystal clear, this is not about saying that we shouldn't have any expectations. Expectations can actually be very helpful. They can encourage us to do more, to do better, to push beyond certain limits that we place on ourselves. And nor is it about saying that we should ignore evidence that tells us that an outcome is unlikely to be good. So let's say, for instance, if you have burned your finger in a flame before, then if it's the same flame and the same finger, it's not an effective approach to assume that the result will be better just because you've built an expectation that it will be better. Hmm. Similarly, just because something happened one way before doesn't mean it will happen the same way again. A classic example of this is the salesperson who knocks on 3 doors and is rejected every time and then gives up because they let the story of their unhelpful expectations dominate and direct their actions. Meanwhile, their colleague who is rejected at 9 doors and still knocks on the 10th gets the sales contract she was looking for because she didn't let the combination of experience and negativity bias blind her to possibility, which still exists alongside expectations. So, one thing that I do actually want to say as well, just in terms of the meta expectations, I'm Irish. And this is just a little fun example, for instance. So I'm Irish. People will probably assume certain things about me. You can assume that I love potatoes. I find potatoes absolutely delicious and I am very, very particular about them. So, tick, I've got a little, one of the things that people think about Irish people is true for me. Not true for everyone, but it's true for me. The next thing is I'm Irish. You might think I love Guinness. I don't. I've never liked it. I hate it. And the third thing is that you might think, oh, she's Irish. She must celebrate St. Patrick's Day every year. Never liked that either. I always associate it with being cold and wet. So there we go. Of 3 things that people typically think about in relation to Irish people, only one of them is true for me. So as meta expectations go, I pretty much fail at being Irish. But anyway, this is I guess how we have to think about everyone we meet. You know, if you've met one Irish person, you've met one Irish person. We will have things in common, but we will also have an awful lot of differences. Now, to review and just go back on a few things from today, we've looked at a number of very important concepts. We've talked about expectations, assumptions, predictions, and biases. We've talked about 4 different sources of expectations in our lives. We've looked at why expectations and biases can be so attractive in our brains. And we've talked about why expectations can form mini stories and meta stories about how things are in the world. We've also talked about what happens when our expectations are not met and why the World Cup really should consider introducing teams of armadillos for the next competition. And finally, we've looked at why all of this is important for our personal and professional success. Sometimes, of course, our expectations are exceeded. Things go better than expected. But the chances are that you remember the times you were disappointed more clearly than the times that you were amazed and delighted, because our brain uses that negativity bias to help you avoid further disappointment. Now, having all this information is great, but when we identify expectations, we need to be able to work through them and decide what to do with them. So this is where Gabriella and I have developed a suite of tools that will be built into the book. So if you're curious about that, come on over to LinkedIn and follow me, and all the updates and news will be on there if we're not already connected. For now, though, what I'd recommend is that you look at the expectations that you're aware of in your life and categorize whether they are expectations that you have of yourself, expectations that someone else has of you, expectations that you have of someone else, or some kind of meta expectations that just seem like it's so big or so vague that there's not even really a root that you can identify for it. Now, when you've identified the bucket that those expectations belong to, there are two more questions. Number one, is this expectation making me more or less effective? And by that I mean, is it helping me to fulfill my get out and walk, to fulfill my potential, to be happy or to be healthy? And when I look at this expectation, question number two, when I look at it with awareness, do I choose to continue with this story, this expectation, this worldview, or do I choose to release from it? Now, when you start looking at your world and your expectations through these lenses, I can guarantee you that things will start to change. So, of course, if there is anyone who is listening to this, either here or in a replay, and you want to level up your leadership or personal development, there is so much that we can discuss about this, particularly with regards to how awareness of your brain working helps you to develop leadership. So if anybody does want to have a conversation about that, come on over to LinkedIn and say hello and get in touch, and we will take it from there. So I would like to say a big thank you again to everybody who's been paying attention, and I hope that this has been useful for you. And if there are any questions, obviously I'm more than happy to answer them at the end. So I will hand back to you now, Obehi. Thank you so much.
I really think that, of course, there are questions that I've already laid down that I'm going to ask you later. Just for the sake of time, I would have liked to comment, but I cannot because of time. Otherwise, it will just take us a little bit longer. And I want other people to talk. But anyway, just hang on there. I'm coming with some questions for you, okay?